The problem with analogies The problem with analogies like this is that they obscure the true leap of faith that is their goal to make the business seems less risky. They are used to persuade investors, employees, or partners to sign on. Most entrepreneurs would cringe to see their leap of faith written this way. Large numbers of people already wanted access to the World Wide Web. They knew what it was, they could afford it, but they could not get access to it because the time it took to load images was too long. When progressive images loading was introduced, it allowed people to get into the World Wide Web and tell their friends about it. Thus, Company X won Market Y. Similarly, there is already a large numbers of potential customer who want access to our product right now. They know they want it, they can afford it, but they cannot access it because the rendering is too slow. When we debut our product with progressive rendering technology, they will flock to our software and tell their friends, and we will win market wide too. There are several things to notice in this revised statement. First, it's important to identify the fact clearly. Is it really? Is it really true that progressive image loading caused the adoption of the World Wide Web, or was this just one factor among many? More important, is it really true that there are large numbers of potential customers out there who want our solution right now? The earlier analogy was designed to convince a stakeholder that a reasonable first step is to build a new startup technology and see if customer will use it. The res- the restated approach should make clear that what is needed is to do some empirical testing first. Let's make sure that there really are hungry customers out there eager to embrace our new technology, analog and anti-logs. There is nothing intrinsically wrong with by basing strategy on comparison to other companies and industries. In fact, that approach can help you discover assumptions that are not really leaps of faith. For example, the venture capitalist Randy Commissar, whose book Getting to Plan B discussed the concept of leaps of faith in great detail, use a framework of analogs and antilogs to plot a strategy. He explained the analog anti-log concept by using the iPod as an example. If you were looking for analogs, you would have to look at the Walkman. He says it solved a critical question that Steve Jobs never had to ask himself. Will people listen to a music in a public place using earphones? We think of that as a nonsense question today, but it is fundamental. When Sony asked the question, they did not have the answer. Steve Jobs had the answer in the analog version. Sony Walkman was the analog. Jobs then had to face the fact that although people were willing to download music, they were not willing to pay for it. Napster was an anti-log. That anti-log had to lead him to address his business in a particular way. Commissar says, out of these analog and anti-log come a series of unique unanswered questions. Those are leap of faith that I, as an entrepreneur, am taking. If I go through with this business venture, they are going to make or break my business. In the iPod business, one of those leaps of faith was that people would pay for music. Of course, that leap of faith turned out to be correct. Beyond the right place at the right time. There are any number of famous entrepreneurs who made millions because they seems to be in the right place at the right time. However, for every successful entrepreneur who was in the right place in the right time, there are many more who were there too in the right. in that right place at the right time, but still managed to fail. Henry Ford was joined by nearly 500 other entrepreneurs in the early 20th century. Imagine being an automobile entrepreneur trained in state of the art engineering on the ground floor of one of the biggest market opportunities in history, yet the vast majority managed to make no money at all. We saw the same phenomenon with Facebook, which faced early completion from other college based social networks whose had start proved irrelevant. What differentiates the success stories from the failure is that the successful entrepreneurs had the foresight, the ability, and the tool to discover which part of their plans were working brilliantly and which were misguided and adapt their strategies accordingly. Value and growth. As we saw in the Facebook story, two leaves of faith stand above all others: the value creation hypothesis and the growth hypothesis. The first step in understanding a new product or service is to figure out if it is fundamentally value creating or value destroying. I use the language of economics in referring to value rather than profit because entrepreneurs include people who start not for profit social venture, those in public sector startup and internal change agent who do not judge their success by profit alone. Even more confusing, there are many organizations that are widely profitable in the short term but ultimately value destroying, such as the organization of Ponzi schemes and fraudulent or misguided companies, for example, Enron and Lehman Brothers. A similar thing is true for growth. As with value, it's essential that entrepreneurs understand the reason behind a startup growth. There are many value destroying kinds of growth that should be avoided. An example would be a business that grew through continuous fundraising from investors and a lot of paid advertising but does not develop a value creating product. Such businesses are engaged in what I call success theater, using the appearance of growth to make it seems that they are successful. One of the goal of innovation accounting, which is discussed in depth in chapter 7, is to help differentiate these false startups from true innovators. Traditional accounting judge new ventures by the same standard it uses for established companies, but these indications are not reliable predictors of a startup future prospect. Consider companies such as Amazon.com that racked up huge losses on their way to breakthrough success. Like its traditional counterpart, innovation accounting requires that a startup have and maintain a quantitative financial model that can be used to evaluate progress rigorously. However, in a startup earliest days, there is not enough data to make an informed guess about what this model might look like. A startup earliest strategic plans are likely to be launched or intuition guided, and that is a good thing to translate those instincts into data. Entrepreneur must, in Steve Blank's famous phrase, get out of the building and start learning. Ginchi Gimbutsu. The importance of basing a strategy decision on first-hand understanding of customers in one of the core principles that underlies the Toyota production system. At Toyota, this goes by the Japanese term Jinchi Gimbitsu, which is one of the most important phrases in the lean manufacturing vocabulary in English. It is usually translated as a directive to go and see for yourself. So that business decision can be based on deep first-hand knowledge. Jeffrey Liker, who has extensively documented the Toyota way, explained it this way. In my Toyota interview, when I asked what distinguished the Toyota way from other management approaches, the most common first response was Ginchi Gimbutsu, Whether I was in manufacturing, product development, sales, distribution, or public affairs, you cannot be sure you really understand any part of any business problem unless you go and see for yourself firsthand. It is unacceptable to take anything for granted or to rely on the reports of others. To demonstrate, take a look at the development of Toyota Sienna minivan for the 2004 model year. At Toyota, the manager responsible for the design and development of a new model is called the chief engineer, a cross-functional leader who oversees the entire process from concept to production. The 2004 Sienna was assigned to Yuji Yokawa, who had very little experience in North America, which was the Sienna primary market. To figure out how to improve the minivan, he proposed an audacious entrepreneurial undertaking: a road trip spanning all 50 US states, all 13 provinces, and territories of Canada, and all part of Mexico. In all, he logged more than 53 miles of driving. In a small town and large cities, Yokowa would rent a current model Sienna, driving it in addition to taking to and observing real customers. From those first-hand observations, Yokawa was able to start testing his critical assumptions about what North American consumer wanted in the minivan. It is common to think of selling to consumer and easier than selling to enterprise because customer like the complexity of multiple departments and different people playing different roles in the purchasing process. Yukawa discovered this was untrue for the customer. The parents and the grandparents may own the minivan, but it's the kids who rule it. It's the kid who occupy the near two-thirds of the vehicle, and it's the kids who are the most critical and the most appreciative of their environment. If I learned anything in my travel, it was the new Cena would need kid appeal. Identify these assumptions, help guide the car's development. For example, Yokohama spent an unusual amount of the seen a development budget on internal comfort features which are critical to a long distance family road trip. Such trips are much more common in America than in Japan. The results were impressive, boosting the Sina market share dramatically. The 2004 model sales were 60% higher than those in 2003. Of course, a product like the Sina is a classic sustaining innovation, the kind that the world best managed established companies such as Toyota excel at. Entrepreneurs face a different set of challenges because they operate with much higher uncertainty, while a company working on a sustaining innovation knows enough about who and where their customers are to use Junchi Gembutsu to discover what customer wants. A startup early contact with potential customer mainly reveals their assumptions require the most urgent testing. Get out of the building. Numbers tells a compelling story, but I always remind entrepreneurs that metrics are people too. No matter how many intermediaries lie between a company and its customer, at the end of the day, customers are everything. Thinking, buying individual, their behavior is measurable and changeable. Even when one is selling to large institution as in a business to business model, it helps to remember that those business are made up of individuals. All successful sales models depends on breaking down the monolithic view of organization into the disparate people that make them up. As Steve Blank has been teaching entrepreneur for years, the fact that we need to gather about customer market and suppliers and channel exist only outside the building. A startup needs extensive contact with potential customers to understand them. So get out of your chair and get to know them. The first step in this process is to confirm that your leap of faith questions are based in reality, that the customer has a significant problem worth solving. When Scott Cook conceived Intuit in 1982, he had a vision at that time quite radical that someday consumer would use personal computers to pay bills and keep track of expenses. When Cook left his counseling job to take the entrepreneurial plunge, he didn't start with stacks of market research or in-depth analysis at the whiteboard. Instead, he picked up two phone books, one of the Palo Alto, California, where he was living at the time, and the other for Winnetka, Illinois. Calling people at random, he inquired if he could ask them a few questions about the way they manage their finance. Those early conversations were designed to answer this leap of faith questions. Do people find it frustrating to pay bills by hand? It turned out that they did, and this early validation gave Cook the confirmation he needed to get started on a solution. Those early conversations did not delve into the product features of a proposed solution that at time would have been foolish. The average consumer at the time were not conversant enough with personal computer to have an opinion about whether they want to use them in a new way. Those early conversations were with mainstream customer, not early adopters. Is still the conversation yielded a fundamental insight. If Intuit could find a way to solve this problem, three could be a large mainstream audience on which it could build a significant business. Design and customer archetype. The goal of such early contact with customer is not to gain definitive answer. Instead, it is to clarify at a basic course level that we understand our potential customer and what problem they have. With that understanding, we can craft a customer archetype, a brief document that seeks to humanize the proposed target customer. This archetype is an essential guide for product development, ensure that the daily prioritization decision that every product team are must make or align with the customer to whom the company aims to appeal. There are many techniques for building an accurate customer archetype that have been developed over long years of practice in the design community. Traditional approaches such as interaction design or design thinking are enormously helpful. To me, it has always seemed ironic that many of these approaches are highly experimental and iterative, using techniques such as rapid prototyping and in person customer observation to guide designer work. Yet, because of the way design agencies traditional have been compensated, all this work culminates in monolithic deliverable to the client. All of a sudden, the rapid learning and experimentation is stopped. The assumption is that the designer have learned all there is to know. For a startup, there is an unworkable model. No amount of design can anticipate the many complexity of bringing a product to life in a real world. In fact, a new breed of designer is developing brand new techniques under the banner of lean user experience, lean UX. They recognize that the customer archetype is a hypothesis, not a fact. The customer profile should be considered provisional until the strategy has shown via validated learning that we can serve this type of customers in a sustainable way.